Welcome to another episode of Four Guys Talking About AI. I'm here with my good friends John Gerard, Greg Sterling, and Neil Polacek. Hey guys, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Nice to see
Doing great.
you.
Doing great. Nice to see you. All right, so good stuff happening in the world of AI. Really compelling week here. Our top stories that we're going to cover this week are NVIDIA is basically the market. We'll talk about how NVIDIA is driving the stock market and how that affects all the other stocks in the NASDAQ. And then we'll also cover consumers getting content from AI and how they're feeling about this kind of concept when publishers are creating content and maybe not disclosing that they're using AI and how that's impacting their brands and how Gen Z feels about AI. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's been some articles around that and various business models around ads versus subscription and what's also happening in the legal space with respect to AI. So first off, let's talk about NVIDIA because today is NVIDIA's big quarterly earnings announcement. The market has been all eyes on NVIDIA. They're going to announce it later today, probably in a couple of hours here. But before they do, the market is currently right now is taking a big hit. And it's just so interesting to see that one company, NVIDIA, has gone from this relatively small company 2-3 years ago to now over a $3 trillion company. And they are driving the NASDAQ. It's unquestionable what's happening there.
Almost obscure company a couple of years ago. You know, very few people outside of the community knew what the company was.
And now I think they're only behind Apple in terms of market capitalization. And they for a while were number one, I think. And they may be number one again today. You know, we'll see.
Without a doubt, the hottest company in the AI space. And yes, there's ChatGPT and Anthropic and others, but NVIDIA is the big winner in AI. And their earnings are going to decide what happens with the market here. It's fascinating.
I was going to make the analogy that it's like the Levi's of to the gold rush, right? So the Levi's supplied all the prospectors and opportunists, and they're sort of doing the same thing. They're a little bit more important, perhaps, than Levi's was to the gold rush, but a little more central. But nonetheless, they're feeding the whole thing.
Most definitely, and the demand that's happening with Google and Meta and Amazon and others, Microsoft, those are all the buyers of these chips. And NVIDIA has this moat where they've got the exclusive on the market for the time being. So all those dollars are flowing directly into NVIDIA. And it's going to be really interesting. The market is expecting NVIDIA to meet their numbers. We'll see what happens if they blow it out of the water and really beat their numbers. But word on the street is that they're poised to be able to do that. We'll see what happens later today. To me, it's just fascinating that there's one company really driving the NASDAQ right now. And yes, Microsoft, Meta, Google, Apple, they're all relevant, very relevant. But NVIDIA is the belle of the ball here.
Well, but they're the buyers, right? So they're super relevant, those companies you listed. They're just not the beacon that's sort of driving all this. But without them buying those chips, there's not a lot to talk about here.
I don't know if this is true equally of Microsoft and Apple, but I think Google is trying to develop their own chip, and there are a bunch of companies working on this. So, it won't be forever that NVIDIA remains kind of in this exclusive position that they're in today.
We have certainly seen situations before where there's, one or two companies that have this explosive moment and so much attention is on them. One of the really interesting things about this kind of growth is that, baked into some of the assumptions about what's happening next is what has happened in the last couple of years, which has been, algorithmic growth, right? So this is doubling upon doubling upon doubling upon doubling. And something that's very interesting about that kind of growth, it's very hard for us to get our heads around it psychologically, is that it may happen another time or even two, but at some point it stops. There just is no way for things to keep doubling, every year forever. One of the greatest ever examples of that is try to fold a piece of paper in half 7 times. It's impossible. Like it's actually the physics of it don't work. And so all things break on an algorithmic curve. And if they didn't, then NVIDIA would take over the entire universe at some point, and that's unlikely to happen. So, the question really is not if the brakes are going to get hit, but it's really when.
Right.
And the market is actually reacting to it today and over the past few days to say that breaking point might even be today in their earnings, that they might just be not as strong as the market expects. We'll see. But fascinating to see that the market is down quite a bit today in anticipation of that.
I think they're not going to hit their numbers. That's my instinct.
Well, the expectation is that they're going to meet the street, right? The Wall Street analysts' expectations.
My expectation is that they're not going to meet the street's expectations.
It's interesting. I mean, when you look at, Elon just bought a whole bunch of NVIDIA chips for his data center. And, he's not only leaning into it for X.AI, but he's also leaning into it for Twitter, for Tesla. And, that's three big companies in one as a purchaser of those chips. So he just built one of the largest data centers that have NVIDIA chips in them, if not the biggest. That was all done recently. So we'll see what happens with those numbers. All right. So moving on to the next topic here. So consumers getting content from AI. There's an article about Google agrees to the first newsroom funding deal. It's already unpopular. The year that AI and the election, how AI is impacting the election. OpenAI announces a deal with Condé Nast and Wired Magazine and The New Yorker and Vogue. So, a lot of interesting partnerships that are happening here. Greg, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, there are a number of different things going on there. So in the Condé Nast deal, that's a training deal, right? So there's OpenAI and to a lesser degree, Google did a big deal with Reddit. That's for training data to train subsequent large language models or existing and future large language models, content licensing. The Google deal in California to help fund journalism, I think it's the value is $250 million over a period of time. And Gemini is a piece of that, as I understand it. And so they're kind of trying to, it's a PR thing for Google. They're helping support local journalism, which they have been instrumental in helping kill on some level, although they would dispute that. Journalists and newsrooms are supposed to be trying to figure out how AI fits into the mix, not necessarily in generating articles, but as research tools and in other forms. But I think it's kind of self-serving in that regard because they're trying to insinuate Gemini everywhere they can against OpenAI. So I think there's probably ambivalence about that as journalism sort of reckons with how to deal with it. The other piece there, the AI election that wasn't a New York Times piece, was basically saying that various candidates all around the country, down ballot races, national races, have largely shunned AI. AI is available, different kinds of tools, and they are, according to this article, largely not using them. That will change, of course, in the future, but at least right now, that seems to be the case. And then the other sort of bigger piece of it is, increasingly you're seeing publishers experiment or roll out AI content creation. So articles, summaries, different kinds of content, sometimes with a clear disclosure that AI was involved, sometimes not. And there have been some embarrassing situations where publishers have been caught trying to pass AI content off as human written. CNET, Sports Illustrated, most recently a Gannett site, a product review site called review.com, and they've gotten caught every time. And, I think if you look at the survey data, what you see is that consumers express ambivalence about AI content. They're okay with it in certain situations and not in others. But what they really don't like is when it's not disclosed, when it's not labeled. People want transparency, and they want to understand when what they're reading has been generated by a machine versus a human being. So it's a little bit murky, but obviously publishers and journalists are going to continue to wrestle with where AI fits in the content creation process and in the organization. And, you know, that will play out over time.
I find it kind of curious, Greg, when you say that consumers they want to know where the information's coming from. And yet for the last years, they've been reading social media that who knows where that stuff is coming from. And they seem to consume it and digest it. And
there's the appearance, at least on social media, that, I mean, there's two sort of sources. When somebody in your network, pushes something out or repeats something, retweets something, republishes something, and then like recommended content or content that sort of appears in your feed because of
Right.
something that you've done or read. And so you're right in one sense that there's really no difference here, but at least people have the sense on social media that there's some human in the mix or there's some credible source in the mix, which is often not true, right? There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation
right.
on social media. It's a major problem, especially during an election year when you've got foreign interference and you've got people who are actively trying to use social media to confuse people, whatever it is. I mean, there's active sort of voter manipulation going on, and the social media sites have become more lax about content moderation through budget cuts or just, because they can, because of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So you're right. You're absolutely right, Neil. But I mean, I think in general, people want transparency and they want to be able to assess the credibility of the source. So
the difference is also that it's user-generated content on the one end and branded content on the other, right? And so people tend to trust brands that are journalism first, not user-generated content first. Whereas like user-generated content, people trust that information as well, no doubt. Totally hear you on that. But I think there's a perception with branded content that somehow
it has a higher
journalism integrity that happens there that doesn't necessarily have to exist with user-generated content.
Depending on the media brand
Sure.
itself, right? I mean, there are different expectations, obviously.
Depending on the consumer's age profile, too. I mean, we all grew up in an era where news brands really meant something. I'm not sure there's that much efficacy in that anymore, personally.
Yeah, maybe not. I mean, that's a good point. But I think this idea of the brand promise is really a big deal. Like, I think that, the brand promise for most media brands, even the young whippersnappers targeting the 20-somethings, is like, we are going to use our humans to curate and to analyze and to provide insight. And I think that there's at least some version of, well, hey, if you're starting to let AI do that, what do I need you for? Like, what's the point of the brand and the brand promise that you're putting forward to me?
Where's the value add?
Where's the value add, right? Like, and so I think there's that part of this is that sort of visceral like rejection of like, ooh, this feels weird because you're trying to pretend like it's a human and it's really not. But part of it is just this sort of raw like, well, I don't need you anymore if that's all you're doing. Like I was using your pattern matching, your expertise. You're investigating this stuff full time. You're spending all your time thinking about it. I want to borrow, your pattern matching and understanding based on that view of things. Well, if you're not doing that anymore, what is your value to me?
I suspect the reason that CNET and Sports Illustrated and Gannett did not fully disclose what they were doing was because they were worried that if they did, it would somehow diminish the credibility of those brands.
Right. Because like if you admit it, then I ask, well, then what do I need you for? If you don't admit it and you try to get away with it, then I go, that felt really gross. And what do I need you for?
Right. But they all got caught. And as a consequence, they're all getting punished to varying degrees. I mean, the Gannett site reviewed.com is shutting down. It's not clear exactly why that's happening, but I suspect the scandal is part of it. There's some other things going on probably. The Sports Illustrated brand has been in decline for a long time, and this sort of further, kind of accelerates that decline. And the CNET, which, we were talking in the green room, sold a few years ago to Red Ventures. Viacom, I guess, owned it. And it sold for $500 million, and it was just resold to Ziff Davis for a little over $100 million. So a huge discount. Part of that is the kind of erosion of CNET's brand strength over time, but part of it is also the taint that this kind of AI content scandal has imparted to it. So there's a lot of risk to a brand, which takes a lot of time to build and to establish credibility and trust with the consumer, and has a lot of tangible and intangible value. That can all go away very quickly if you screw this up, or can be really take a big hit if it doesn't go away.
Well, this is a good pivot point into the next topic, which is how Gen Z feels about AI. And, it's so interesting. You mentioned segmenting the audience and how people of different age groups feel about AI. Looking at Gen Z and focusing on them, there's a new Samsung study that talks about how nearly 70% of Gen Z side hustlers, AI is critical to their success. Whereas TechCrunch had this article talking about how Gen Z has mixed feelings about AI.
Well, I think they're coming from two different places. I think the ones that are positive are people who are trying to build some side hustle. They don't have a lot of time. They need tools that make it really efficient. They're leaning forward as they lean out of their organization, perhaps. And maybe the other set of respondents are inside an organization and are more fearful of what AI is going to do to them. I think, coming from two different places. And our data, Greg and I have been collecting, says these small businesses are adopting and using and testing and trialing and really sort of leaning into this like they've never done before in other technologies.
I think the Samsung study also included people's use in their existing jobs at work in addition to the side hustle. As Neil's saying, I think people recognize the value of AI as a time saver, as an efficiency tool, as a productivity tool. And so you kind of have to use it in a way. There's a kind of an imperative to use it. Otherwise, you're kind of stupid in some sense. If you can get something done in half the time or very quickly, then it just makes sense to use. But then the ambivalence or the other survey, which is being juxtaposed to the Samsung survey, there was this sort of sense that they were feeling guilty about using it. And then this other related feeling about, well, maybe this is going to make me stupider or less creative or less resourceful if I rely on this tool too heavily. And there was that earlier survey that was talking about creativity. It wasn't a survey, actually. It was a study that was using people's actual writing. And what they found is that low achievers were up-leveled, and very creative people, higher achievers, there was no impact on them. So it worked for the lower level folks in terms of their skills and ability, in this creative context at least. Didn't help the higher achievers. And then there was the concern about sort of the blandification or homogenization or sort of blunting of creativity in the aggregate. But that's sort of a digression. But, everybody feels ambivalent about AI. I mean, there's the doomsday scenarios that the Skynet stuff. Meanwhile, in our day-to-day lives, it's a great tool that we use all the time.
Yeah. I suspect we're going to see, as we've seen with other, very large technology trends like Internet 1.0 and into Web 2.0, a lot of short-term wiggles that ultimately, in the end, turn into this technology, whatever it is, being deeply integrated into the way that culture works and behaves. And, we even had some terms in recognizing that it was likely going to be a generational move in the early internet days, which was digital natives. We talked about kids that grew up in the environment of the internet having a much different view of what's possible and how to do internet stuff than those of us old people who, for whom the internet was invented at some point during our lifetime. Same thing I think will happen here with AI. I don't know if I assume somebody's using the term AI natives. That seems like a term that probably should be talked about, but it's probably the same kind of thing. Like any kid, and I would say, for instance, my kids who are late teens or in the early 20s, they're maybe just a little too old, a little younger than that. Any kid who sort of is coming of age in the AI era will just have a fundamentally different relationship with AI and how to use it.
Well, John, Neil and I were talking to a large-ish agency the other day about their deployment of AI internally. They're not a big five, whatever the whole number of holding companies. They're not part of that universe. And they have some pretty substantial accounts. They're pretty sophisticated.
They're big shot.
Yeah, right. And they were talking, as well as somebody else in a corporate context, about the resistance to internal resistance in some cases of employees to using AI as part of their workflow. And I think that that's where your comments are also relevant, is that some employees are going to be much more receptive to this and are, as a consequence, going to be more efficient and effective. And other employees are going to be more resistant because they just fear change or don't like change. But it raises the question, the concern about like losing your edge or losing your creativity or losing your skills that is expressed in that one Gen Z survey is relevant to the conversation about coding. Right. I mean, I'm throwing in something new here, but I don't know who the AWS CEO is these days. So he made some provocative comment that was leaked or that got out somehow about how some substantial, developers are going to have to do other stuff because coding is all going to be done more or less by AI. And, it raises this question legitimately, will people be de-skilled by heavy reliance on the machine?
There's a conversation that we had about what's happening in law, in businesses that are attorneys, and just where there are opportunities using AI in law. John, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll just follow up on what we talked about last time. This was a real life example of an attorney who's a friend of mine making a decision about the future of his career based, at least a little bit on new AI tools that are available. So he's somebody who's been a quite successful general counsel for a bunch of companies over the years, has worked in law firms, and finally decided to strike out on his own. And at least part of the reason for doing that what had to do with the efficiencies that he had identified he could get out of using the AI tools, specifically with LexisNexis, which of course is the very large aggregator of all legal stuff. And as he reported it, their AI chatbot is extraordinarily good at relying only on the LexisNexis database for answering, targeted questions about the application of the law in whatever jurisdiction it might be, comes complete with, links and references to the material in the LexisNexis database. So, it sounds like they've probably spent some time squeezing the hallucination problem out. Sounds like the answers that come back don't reference cases that don't actually exist, which we know has happened, kind of widely publicized faux pas in the past. So, there it is. There's the example of somebody, in the space who has said, you know what, actually, I can go toe to toe with some of these larger firms as an individual lawyer now, at least in part because of AI. And it was fascinating to hear that. And then the last thing I'll share, which is also germane into what we've been talking about, he also said he has now been cautioning young people looking at getting into the law because of the same trend. So for the opposite set of reasons, which is basically in those firms and as general counsel, he used to put this initial research on the shoulders of these younger associates to go do this. And what he's telling them now is like, look, you don't have a job with me, and you probably don't have a job with the company that I just left either. So you may want to think twice about going into the law. So pretty wild, very, very different things kind of unfolding at least in this one anecdote.
Here's the fascinating thing about that is that the industry was structured as, associate, junior associate, senior associate, whatever, all those levels, right? And as you move through those levels, you gained experience. You learned, you understood more. And then by the time you've done that for 20 or so years or 10 or so years, you are now a partner, right? And you got paid the $2,000, $2,500 an hour because you'd had all this experience. If those rungs go away, okay, where's the next partner generation coming from? That's to me, and that's the same in radiology. You learn through going through this process of looking at X-rays or looking at stuff, and then all of a sudden you're the expert in this form of cancer radiology. Now, who's going to be that expert next time? Because they will not gone through that process. That to me is really a fascinating implication of all this.
Yeah, you're totally right.
I think in the short term, we're straddling. We want the expert to give us comfort that the AI is actually working.
Right.
And in the not too distant future, I think the expert doesn't matter anymore. And I think it's the young upstart 10 years from now who's the AI jockey in the legal space that you actually trust more than the 30-year-old dinosaur or, 30 years in practice dinosaur.
Yeah.
Conversation for another time, but does everything get commoditized, by AI? Everything sort of flattened and commoditized and sort of price pressure downward. Yeah.
That is one view of what might happen.
We'll definitely race to the bottom for pricing. That we're seeing that in other categories as well. But that might not be a bad thing in law, just generally speaking, when you're talking about $1,000 an hour, kind of fee. And I could see organizationally how the new organization of an attorney firm would be where you have somebody senior who's got that experience surrounded by a team of AI experts who are able to productize whatever documents and pulling whatever sources together to be able to support an argument or write contracts or whatever you need to do to execute on, in the law.
And the fee process and how people bid on stuff is going to be really fascinating.
It's not just law, the sort of organizational implications sort of run across industries, and we'll see it play out. But I think we're out of time. Is that right, Andy?
We are, yeah. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening in. We're going to pick it up next week. We are going to post all the references to the materials that we talked about today in our show notes. So go check those out. And we look forward to talking with you next week. Thanks, guys.
Have a great week. See you.
You too.